You're listening to Bedroom Beethovens, where notable music makers break down stories accompanied by songs and melodies documenting growth through their 10,000-hour journey. And me? Well, my name is Cello, your host.
I am a bedroom Beethoven.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 78 of the podcast. My guest this week is...
My name is Mark, the Clive-Lowe, and I'm a keyboard player, producer, composer, performer. Collaboration-wise, it's been a lot of my dream list, like musicians like Pino Palladino and Harvey Mason and Sheila E., a lot of the UK broken beat OGs, Bembe Segway, Four Hero, Restless Soul, IG Culture, and then cats like DJ Spinner, John Robinson, Wajid. I mean, it's a really kind of eclectic crew of, jazz musicians, hip-hop producers, house music producers, even like drum and bass junglists, and just kind of runs the whole gamut. So it's an eclectic life.
Episode 78 with Mark the Clive-Lowe, one of today's contemporary musical masters. A duology 2-album release is kind of the focus of the second half of the interview. It sees him deep dive into his Japanese roots and ancestry through the lens of jazz and electronica, an immersive and evocative soundtrack transporting the listener through his own experience of Japan, along with his love for its history and mythology. So we chat about that, as well as a litany of other topics, including how he plans to move forward once the craziness that is 2020 starts to lift, if ever. At this point, I don't even know. Which is a good segue into telling you how appreciative I am that you guys are tuning in. Podcasts are taking a hit as people aren't commuting nowadays, but I imagine most are here because you enjoy Mark's music and you want to learn more about him. So nevertheless, let me tell you guys that this podcast is always available wherever podcasts can be found, and the website is bedroombeethovens.com. And if you want to support me, the way you support Mark's Patreon, for instance, patreon.com/bedroombeethovens, granted, it's not as cool as his, but if you want to support the show and get access to early episodes and whatnot, you could throw a few quarters my way. I think we're about halfway through the summer. Thanks everyone for being here. Episode 78 with MDCL. Well, Sawubona, my friend.
Oh yeah, Sawubona.
And it's a bit strange because when you first come to LA, you and your son can go to the Staples Center. You can watch Kobe Bryant versus the Rockets, and how much has changed in the last calendar year, man. Kobe's not here anymore. The Staples Center hasn't even been filled in the last half year. Even the little Tokyo neighborhood in LA, which houses the Blue Whale, it's closed down.
Yeah, I mean obviously no one could have foreseen what this year has brought to us, and I think, I guess we definitely took all that stuff for granted, that's for sure. The Blue Whale you mentioned particularly, that's a little jazz club in downtown LA in Little Tokyo. It's very dear to my heart. I love playing there. And I really hope it pulls through. So many places out of business now. I don't know how it's going to work.
Well, I mean, to add insult to injury, I'm in Texas, you're in California, and we're on the top 5 list of states who are handling this the worst, that have the most cases, while New Zealand has 0 cases.
Yeah, I mean, the temptation to go home is there for sure. But I love what's possible being in the States, and there's something actually right now where between the pandemic and how that affects the capitalist structure through to the uprising and how that's affecting racial justice and social justice and change. It's like you're seeing history in the making right now, and I think That's pretty amazing and potent.
You called it though. Back in November of 2016, when Trump was elected, you called it. 53% of white women voted for Trump, and 47% of voters didn't even vote. The election was only lost by 80,000 votes. So, I mean, here's the eerie part. You said, and I quote, "The mask is now off. All that hatred bred into white America that has been there the entire time will come out of hiding and in plain sight, and we will look back on that day and see it as the start of a revolution and the birth of a new nation." End quote. And I think the past month and a half, we haven't seen these levels of protest and an extreme demand for equality and change. Not in this lifetime, at least not since the civil rights movement. So I think you called it.
Man, I said that?
In a public Facebook post. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, that was a real feeling at the time, and it's interesting where we're at. I mean, you put the head of the country as a person who has no leadership skill and just incites, divisive thinking and action, and this is what we come to. But at the same time, I feel like that's what had to happen in order to get to this moment where change is really possible.
I mentioned like New Zealand has 0 cases. I'm kind of familiar like how maybe they operate in, I guess, a dynamic with the States. So you grew up in Auckland, your mom's Japanese, and your dad lived in Japan for 20 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's very interesting because in New Zealand, there's no real strong cultural identity as a modern society.
Well, it is really interesting because for me growing up, I was born in 1974, so growing up through the 1980s as a biracial person in New Zealand, it was really confusing. Like on my European side, on the white side, there was no culture to latch onto because it was slowly kind of pulling away from England, even though that was the motherland. And on my Japanese side, there was all this culture to latch onto, but I was growing up, as a New Zealander. So it wasn't until a little later that I got more interested in that side of it. But then at this point now, it's interesting because I feel like New Zealand as a nation has culturally really taken care to respectfully adopt the Maori culture in many ways. Like, basic language as far as greetings and stuff like that, and how the Pacific Island and Maori accent in English has become the New Zealand accent norm. Things like that have really paradigm shifted in my lifetime and since I've been out of New Zealand. So it's quite amazing to go back there and see this moment in time, which is, I mean, it's a melting pot there, man. Like, for me growing up, being one of the very few biracial people around me, to seeing this amazing open immigration policy to the Pacific Islands, and then to Hong Kong when the UK gave it back to China, and then more of Asia, in more recent years, Brazil. There's this whole kind of like immigrant melting pot, which has become very intertwined, like in my generation and the younger generation too. It's amazing to see, man.
And there's also a difference between Japanese and Japanese American. I think that's important to realize. It's not the same thing. And I bet the first time you went to Japan when you were just a boy, how familiar it seemed. Just getting out of the plane, I bet it smelled like your house. In the airport, in the airport, maybe it smelled like Japan. And I bet you walked out of that plane and thought, this is familiar to me, even though you didn't even see anything yet.
Man, you're so right. Japan, I guess everywhere does, but Japan definitely smells a certain way. And those smells were not foreign to me, but I do remember that they had a new intensity. And so, I go to Japan every summer from age 10 pretty much, and, grew up very much in touch with my family there and the language. But it wasn't until I went there at the end of high school, I did my last year of high school in Yokohama. I'm like 17, I'm thinking, I know about this, I'm half Japanese, I know this culture. I got such major culture shock, man, because it's deep. It's like, it's like any culture. It's like we can feel by studying or by actually directly relating to it in a family environment, like from a removed point of view, like I did. It's easy to feel like, yeah, I know that. But, culture is such a multifaceted, nuanced, layered, deep thing. And like any other country's culture, it's an onion. You can just keep peeling back the layers, and there's more there,
Small things too, like how people grab a piece of paper. There are things that are more obvious, like taking someone's business card with 2 hands. You don't do that in the States.
Sure, for sure. Yeah.
Did your siblings deal with it better than yourself?
So he was the what's the word? Like the archetypal eldest son, good at everything, just So with Japanese, he really went in on that. My middle brother, he actually ran the other way. He denied being part Japanese and didn't learn the language, and then later on really regretted that. So I guess each of us had a very different experience.
Okay, because I know you had an older brother who kind of played the piano with you, or your father kind of forced you guys to start with an instrument.
Oh yeah, Dad was denied lessons when he was as a kid. So when he was 13, I remember he'd tell the story. He's 13, and his father, who's also a musician, was like, "Okay, I guess you can learn piano now." And so he's 13. He's like thinking it's too late.
It's too late, yeah.
So he would quote this at his, like, when we have friends around for dinner, and he'd be having a few drinks and telling us stories. He's like, from that moment, I thought, come hell or high water, if I ever have children, they'll bloody well learn musical instruments.
I was the same way. Have you ever heard of the Suzuki method of teaching
Totally,
piano?
man. Totally, yeah.
That's what I grew up on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So for people who are listening that don't know, people created this method to teach children music as if they were being immersed in a foreign language. So I was exposed to music. I learned to listen to the piece before any attempt at reproducing the song, which I think is bad because I had a hell of a time learning how to read sheet music. And I remember wowing the kids, but disappointing the adults with my playing because of it. So it had this interesting dynamic.
Man, I tell you, if I could do it all again, I wish I had learned Suzuki.
Hey, that's great praise, because I mean, you're teaching a kid to be immersed as if they were learning a foreign language, and I never learned a foreign language, so that's the closest I ever got.
That's beautiful, man. Because music is an oral tradition. It's not a visual. It's not a form that you read. We have music notation, so we can communicate. So we could communicate before you could record music, and it's standardized. But music is oral. So I love the Suzuki method's whole premise that, before you play this, your ear's going to learn it.
Well, with all great musicians, I think John Lennon put the guitar down for 10 years. You kind of stopped playing for a decade as well.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to unpack there, because the parallels of playing piano again, playing it because you want to versus being forced to practice as a kid. I think number one, was it like riding a bike? Or did you have to relearn a lot of things? And maybe number two, now that you're playing again from the perspective of more enjoyment, how did that transform your playing?
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, like you say. And I mean, the point when I stopped playing piano, I was still playing keys. But I think for non-musicians, it's worth saying that the acoustic piano and a keyboard are completely different instruments. The interface is the same, but the acoustic piano, you're dealing with wood and strings, and like it's physical. It's very physical, and the human interface with that, there's no USB or nothing. It's real, So add on top of that, for me, that my dad forced me on this instrument, and I never chose it. I wasn't like the kid who went to a gig, saw the bass player, heard the bass sound, and was like, "Man, I'm going to play bass." I never had that moment. So I did have that moment later on with drum machines and jungle and house music and hip hop and basically everything I could hear in the club, which was, in my mind, as far away from the piano as you could go. So once I was living in the UK and working in the broken beat scene with producers and doing keyboard sessions and then producing my own tracks, that became my instrument, like chopping samples and beats and playing synths and that kind of thing. So then, I come to LA after a decade in the UK, and actually my ex-wife, amazing singer-songwriter Nia Andrews, she was having her debut gig, and she was like, "I want you to play piano." And I said, "No, I'll play Rhodes. I'm not playing piano." She's like, "It's my gig. I want you to play piano." So I played. There was a baby grand in the venue. I played piano on that gig.
Let me get this straight. You were not the only one. Came and went as you pleased, and it was all just for fun. When he drew the play, what'd you do? Did you run?
And it was a real moment of reconnection. It felt like, oh yeah, this is my old friend. This is my instrument. There's no escaping that for me. And so then as I played it more and I'd start doing actually jazz gigs in LA, as a piano player, which kind of freaked me out. I found that I'd lost a lot of technical facility that I had 10 years earlier. So I couldn't play as cleanly or fast, or my fingers just hadn't been doing that work. So that was one thing. And then the other massive thing was that I realized now I was playing with the ears of a producer, which is a very different thing to playing. Well, I guess it's the ideal, playing as a musician, but for a lot of musicians, it's not like that. So going through production and learning more about that, and going through a form in the UK through club music and broken beat where, every sound is functional and necessary, and every part is, there's no fluff, basically. So it was the challenge there was being as musical as possible while being as functional as possible in this kind of progressive dance floor scene. And so taking that kind of mentality, or even like a hip hop sample loop mentality, and then applying that to playing piano, for me was a paradigm shift.
And now it's evolved into where you can take all of those elements and infuse or involve your culture. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Mike Shinoda once, and I always appreciated but wanted more tracks like Kenji, which tells the tale of internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. I love music that infuses a little bit of heritage, a little bit of history.
My father came from Japan in 1905. He was 15 when he immigrated from Japan. He worked until he was able to buy to actually build a store.
I mean, that was so special for me to do my project called Heritage. It's like a 2-album release last year, and I'd been wanting to do something incorporating more of that side of my heritage and roots, but I guess I didn't quite, when I was younger, understand how to connect it through my artistry. And then in, I think, 2017, I was commissioned by Grand Performances, which was a music commissioning presenting organization here in LA, to do a show which had to fulfill actually their requirement to present some Asian heritage programming. So I was like, well, I have something that I've always wanted to do, so if you'll let me do it. And they commissioned me for this show, which was called Mirai no Rekshi, which is actually what I wrote when I wrote most of the material for Heritage. And I brought in some different collaborators, Kaoru Watanabe, great Shinobu flute player and taiko drummer, Yumi Kurosawa, great koto player, and then Shingo too as well. He was on the Vestax fader board, kind of effects and electronic percussion, and on mic a bit as well. And then I added my band, and we had this whole experience of music, which I put together for it and wrote for it with a lot of story. And I'd never brought storytelling into my work as a performer. If I'm doing an electronic set in the club, I'm not talking. It's like this is a dance floor event. And then I might be doing a jazz show where I might talk a little bit, but the music wasn't as meaningful to me or as personal. So I'm creating a body of work that really takes from my experiences growing up biracially Japanese and New Zealander, the Japanese fairy tales and folk songs I'd learned, my experiences going to Japan over the last 35 years. These were all things I could pull from. And it was actually the first time I felt like, the first time in a long time I felt like, oh, here's something that's so honestly personal. To the point, right before I released it as Heritage, as the albums, I was a little scared of releasing it. I was like, it's kind of like I'm putting myself on my inner self on show here.
In 2005, you released an album called Tides Are Rising. Also in 2005, Mike Shinoda released an album called The Rising Tide.
Hey!
And he used that to be his personal album. And then I re-listened to your album, and it's always a nice touch to include your son's heartbeat at the end of the song, right before he was born. That makes it more personal. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear that Heritage was, well, maybe the reason why it's not scary for Mike Shinoda to release that project, and maybe more so for you, is because, like you said, you're vulnerable. It showcases you putting your heritage in a positive light, showcasing your composing and keyboarding skills front and center. Like, I can't give The Rising Tide a negative review. a song about after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans, including his family, were forced into camps in retaliation. Pff, that's stupid. You know what I mean? You can't give an album like that a negative review.
It just is.
Yeah, important songs like revolutionary songs, they aren't subjected to criticism. Whereas if you put your heritage and your talents out front for people to hear, see, and absorb, it's scary. You know what I mean? Nobody is going to say Public Enemy sucks.
Right, exactly. But and it was great for me because I feel like I'm on this. I've gone through this journey that still continues, but it's gone through being really young and wanting to be a straight ahead jazz musician. Actually, before that, even momentarily wanting to be Teddy Riley and falling deep into that whole world, and then later on falling into club music and wanting to do that, and kind of learning a lot along the way, but oftentimes not really knowing where do I find myself in this. And I think jazz is a really interesting point of reference because there's so much aspiration growing up, if you're into that music as a musician, that you're aspiring directly to the Black American music legacy. And you can't be that if you're not that. You can play the music and understand where it comes from, but to really aspire to it, I think the lesson in it is to aspire to that depth of personal expression. And that is what jazz is. That is what Black American music is. So for me, I've recognized that where I meet that, whether it's my love for Dilla or my love for Thelonious Monk, whoever it might be, whereas maybe when I was younger, I might have tried to emulate that. Now it's more like, okay, I recognize that as a musician, as an artist, I meet that music and there's a space between it and me. Like I can't be it and it can't be me. So that space in between us, the way I interact with that music and my influences and inspirations, that becomes the defining texture and characteristic of the expression. So I'm realizing that I'm finding my own voice through coming up to Japanese tradition and knowing that I'm not full Japanese and I didn't grow up there fully. So there's a difference, but the space where that difference is where I can find my expression.
How did the 90s hip hop kind of go into that? You were listening to a lot of 5% Nation music. Were you conscious of that?
Okay, so no, I wasn't. Okay, so I'm growing up in Auckland, New Zealand, in the through the 80s, late 80s into the early 90s. I started high school in 88, 89, something 88, and so I was basically in a very Eurocentric culture. So at school, like at the high school I started, when I started there, you'd have all the Pacific Island kids would be kind of in their own crew, and then all the Chinese immigrant kids would be in their own crew, and that would leave the Europeans basically would have the majority crew. Now it's all very, very intertwined, like I said before. But so here I am, like not knowing where I fit in. Like there wasn't a Japanese crew per se, and for so I was closest to the Palangi, the European crew, the Pakeha crew, and that community found me a bit different. Like it's like, well, you're half Asian, that's weird, kind of thing. And so 13 years old, I was looking for different cultural touchstones. And also at that age where you start to, one starts to rebel against the powers that raised you. My dad was very dominant and strict. So I think subconsciously I was looking for ways to push against him. And I found that in music. It started, my boy Joe, a friend of mine at school, we're like 14. He walks up to me before school with his Walkman, puts his Walkman earphones on me. And it was the first Guy album. It was Teddy's Jam. And I'd never heard anything like it. Blew my mind, absolutely changed my life in a split second. It's all my friends are listening to like, UK guitar pop and stuff like that. And it never resonated with me. I don't know why. But this just totally resonated. And so I'd start going to the record store and started hanging out with people who are making music and going to, I remember I went to a talent show, like a Talent Quest talent show thing when I was about that age. And I had some keyboards and a drum machine, kind of a rudimentary version of what I do now, but I had no idea what I was doing. But I was making sound. And there was a crew of kids, like Samoan kids, who came over and they're like, man, I love what you do. Come around to the house. So I went around to their house and they were all making like hip hop and New Jack Swing. And there was DJs and dancers and rappers and singers and musicians. And I'd never experienced anything like that. And also the vibrancy of creative freedom, friendship, and cultural openness and all that was the antithesis to what I'd been raised in. So for me, that kind of started my love affair with hip hop, and just realizing that there was community in it and there was culture in it, and it wasn't about conforming to traditionalist rules.
But there's no better way to piss off your dad as a teenager than to listen to Brand Nubian.
Man, listen. So he'd go out, and so I basically wasn't allowed to use the record player. So I had tapes in my room, but I had a lot of vinyl. So he'd go out, and I could jump straight on the turntable, and I'll never forget. Like I had It Takes a Nation of Millions just blasting on the record player. And I didn't hear him come home. And so I'm lying on the floor in front of the stereo or something, and he's just standing over me. I turn around and see him. And it wasn't even a conversation. It was just, I knew that I had not impressed him and I better shut this music off. But at the same time, I think about it, and it's like maybe he couldn't even hear the lyrics. I don't know.
Yeah, it was just
like,
noise, I'm sure.
Quite possibly, yeah. Yeah.
But wow, yeah, what a great story. I had a similar story with my mom, but anything that had parental advisory sticker, she would break my tapes.
Oh my God.
And I was listening to the Fugees, and the Fugees now is heralded as this very elegant, introspective,
totally
conscious rap. But at the time, you couldn't make my mom frown any harder than put Praz and Wyclef together. So
wow,
very interesting to always look back and see how parents or the last generation reacts to your music now. And
honestly, I have done this with my son as well. Like, there's I kind of there's a point in contemporary music and like in contemporary rap where lyrically I'm just like, it's overwhelming for me sometimes. And so, especially when he was a bit younger, I just felt like that's not the content I want my son's head filled with. And I really understood the love for the production sound, and I enjoyed it too. But then, when as a parent, like listening to it, digesting what's being said, I'm like, I don't know about that, But now he's like 17 now, so I'm like, okay, cool. No, we can just listen to whatever. But it wasn't lost on me how ironic that was.
Yeah, but what's cool though is your son is in a unique position to where he can put on Heritage 1 and 2, and it's almost like this genealogy lesson for him. I think after Heritage 2 was completed, you continued to learn stories from your mom. And I think when you perform Heritage, sometimes you go into detail about the inspiration behind one, and there are brutal stories. There's that one where she remembers having to get into the bomb shelter trenches in front of her house as a small child in World War II, and U.S. planes would fly overhead dropping bombs on the residency. I think it was just the house next door. So maybe Heritage 3 is like your mom's memoirs in album form.
There is it won't be Heritage 3, but in a sense it is Heritage 3, which is going to actually be my dad passed away almost 10 years ago, and he wrote his memoirs. And so the twist, his 20 years in Japan from 1953 to 73 as the country was rebuilding post-war, and his experience as a New Zealander experiencing all that right there, that's all very heavily documented. So that could be the next one. And that would be, for me, that would be really nice to make peace with our relationship as well. How my dad raised me and how I feel about that, and to actually really go into his world from age 23 to 43 and meet that.
Yeah, and like your grandmother had a passion for European opera, which gave birth to Baroque music at the end of the 16th century. So maybe you could have a track that incorporates that. But I mean, look at me giving you suggestions.
There we go.
I mean, you're the master. I'm out of bounds.
But it's really amazing to find this as an artistic pursuit. Like I spent a long time, especially, I love making club music. I still do a lot of remixes and productions, but that, especially in my mid-20s, coming through that world, oftentimes it's kind of like it's the search for the perfect beat, and you're trying to find the underground hit that's going to resonate and cross over somewhat, or that it's kind of very much in that culture. But to at this point really be reflecting more on my ancestral lineage and my own inner journey, and applying all these things that I love to it. I mean, I'm really grateful to be able to do that, and to also have some audience support, which encourages me that these are stories worth sharing.
But and then at the same time, like, you're still absorbing hip hop too, and your parents are probably seeing this rebellious side, like we covered, and your parents didn't understand it and they didn't approve of it. Why can't he just play the piano? Why can't he just play Gershwin? But in the late 90s, Herbie Hancock came out with Gershwin's World, and maybe that's the push that the next generation needs. You take a musician that you admire who's covering scores that might be a little left of your interest, and all of a sudden your ears perk up and you kind of want to see what it's all about.
I mean, that speaks to me, that speaks to responsibility in artistry. And it's something I feel really passionately about, that, we're, in whatever field of work or walk of life that you're presenting to the world, we're laying information for the next generation. It's inspiration, it's education. And, for sure it can be funny and entertaining and stupid and all sorts of stuff. But in the greater analysis, I think, and this moment in, social history right now is showing us, that we really have a responsibility to the next generation. So yeah, that can come through music for me. It's like, just even a little bit, then that's awesome.
Well, and also I think your generation is the last generation to where, like, you woke up one morning at 17 years old and then you went to bed that same night having seen Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Tony Williams, and then boom, it's life altering. I don't think kids this generation are going to go see, Young Jeezy and Lil Wayne and then go to bed and be like, bam, I'm going to be a rapper. This is what I'm going to do. I think it's more resonating with you. I love hearing stories of kids just getting hit upside the head with music and their pupils dilate as they realize, like, yes. And I think a good example is Leon Ware, who had 10 brothers and sisters. He was the youngest, like you. His dad worked at Ford Motor Company in Detroit. How on earth at age 14 did he sing on a stage to, at 16, singing with Yusef and eventually writing hits for the Isley Brothers and Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones? It's like, that's a different blueprint than appearing on American Idol and winning a golden ticket,
and Leon is still, rest in peace. Leon Ware is still so unsung. The heads know, of course, and then maybe the ones who are real Marvin Gaye fans would find his name, but he's still so unsung. And I got to know him over the last almost 20 years of his life, I guess. We connected before I moved to the States, and once I moved here, I get to hang out at the house with Leon and his wife Carol. And man, Leon, that man obviously has stories. Like, you don't you wouldn't just pop around there for a quick hello. It's like, okay, let me just block out the rest of today, and we're going to go around and have stories and smoke and just chill and kick it. And then, of course, we'd be making music, but what might regularly be a 2-hour session of productive work, every 5 minutes something sparks another story, and I'm not going to be like no, man, we need to work. It's like, no, I need to hear these stories,
Yeah.
So it would take like a year to finish a track because of the stories.
And that's why I started this podcast, because there's a million of those people, right? You got little John Roberts.
Oh my
his high
God.
school teacher introduced him to Wynton Marsalis, and
Yep.
from there he went to Berkeley. Next
Yep.
thing you know, he's on tour with Janet Jackson. Fill in the gaps. You have years
Yeah.
of stories in between that.
Yeah, man. I mean, Little John's the truth. He's the first drummer I played with in America, actually. I knew this vocalist named Julie Dexter in Atlanta, who was from Birmingham, UK. So I knew her through the UK. So I hit her up. I was like, Julie, I'm coming out. Can you do a show with me? And I need a drummer. I need a jazz drummer who can play pocket, who can play broken beat, who can play with the MPC, who can improvise. I was like, gave her this whole list, and she's like, "It's cool, I got you." Didn't even pause. Like, I got you. And I remember getting closer to the gig. I was like hitting her up. I was like, Julie, who's the drummer? Are you sure it's cool? She's like, don't worry, I got you. And so Lil Jon and I meet on stage to play. Like, there was a line check and then we played. No rehearsal, no sound check, nothing. And it was just like love, man. Like, the way the two of us just melded together, it was crazy. And so it was quite a trip to, I didn't know at the time that he is, one of the greatest drummers in this country, like, that have been and that is. And here's my first, US drummer I'm working with, and it's this cat. Like, yeah, we've had so much fun together. And we did one show actually at SF Jazz in San Francisco, which Eric Harlan put together, another great drummer. And it was basically a drummer thing. So Eric had himself on drums, he had Lil Jon Roberts on drums, he had Chris Dave on drums, and then he had me on, beats and samples and keys and stuff. And then the second half, Les Claypool joined us on bass. That shit was insane.
So you wouldn't have had half these stories if you would have went to law school like your dad.
There we
wanted.
go. I mean, but you know what? Like, maybe a law degree I might have treated some of those contracts better over the years. I definitely fell for some shit. Like, I had one record that got it was a major label release, and I'm friends with the A&R at this point. Like, it's now 20 years later, but we had a conversation not too long ago. So long after the fact, the album's reverted to me again. It's done its thing. And he was like, man, I heard that album. I just loved it. It's like, I would have given you anything you wanted for that.
Oh, wow.
I was like, what? Because I took the first offer, because for me at the time, I'm like, oh my God, someone wants to release it, and that sounds okay. And but had I had a law degree, it would have been different.
Don't feel bad though. Adrian Young was going to go to law school.
Oh yeah?
Before he was a b-boy, he was going to practice law. And last week, I think just last week, he released a new Roy Ayers album on his jazz label. So how about that?
Yeah, man. No, he's keeping it moving for real. For real.
So yeah, it happens. Well, let me ask you: in your life, are you still in a selfish place in terms of artistry? Like, you're forced to not tour. You can play gigs, but all you can be is kind of stagnant. But once the world opens up again, is life work balance out the window? How are you going to approach your life moving forward?
I think this is definitely a pivot point for me. I've literally been on tour for the last 20 years. Until March the 12th, I was on tour for 20 years. It's really exciting. And I love to tour. I love to travel, meet people, play in different places. If I put that all to the side, then we're talking about, a lot of flights, and flying is exhausting. I'm carrying like over 100 pounds of equipment with me, as well as my personal stuff. And it's exhausting. It's taxing. And I'd been kind of thinking, I need to change this over the last few years, but it's like a hamster wheel. It's a livelihood. It is fun. It's addictive. It's like I'm always going somewhere. But then, coronavirus hits, and I had no choice. The whole thing had to stop. And as soon as it stops, my whole calendar opened up, and then these amazing opportunities started to come into my life, which all speak more to doing things in new ways. I'm the founding artist in residence with La Sabre Festival, which is this great online festival, which have allowed me to do a lot of creative things. And then, getting my live streaming chops together and just looking at different projects which I could never commit to, even like Patreon. I avoided Patreon because I was like, well, I'm always traveling, so how am I going to be in one place to fulfill the commitment to my supporters? It feels great. Like, my body feels so much better for not being cramped up in a plane every other day and in a different time zone every other day and not carrying all this gear around every other day. And so, yeah, for me, this has been a really silver lining filled time, and showing me that there's other ways to do this. So I do want to be touring, but not the way I was before. I'd love to have it in a position where I can just, focus on the things I really want to do and not do, 7 gigs in 7 days just because I have to.
I always felt like you were kind of like your father in the sense where your father left New Zealand to go to Japan in his early 20s, and he went for 3 months, but he ended up staying a lot longer. Once you get to a new location, whether it's London or LA, you never know how long you're going to be there or what opportunities it could bring. I thought you were going to be bored out of your mind being in one place, but I mean, you're right. You're taking advantage of these IG live performances. You have a lot better Wi-Fi than Teddy Riley, I'll say, and your Patreon is thriving, and so I'm glad that you view this as a pivot and you're thriving. It's good.
I mean, I tell you what. On March the 12th, I play with this great sax player named Hayley Neiswanger. She has a band called May Sun. And so we had a May Sun gig at SF Jazz. So we were driving up to San Fran on March the 12th and listening to the governor, listening to Gavin Newsom making a public address. We were like maybe 2 hours from San Fran. So we've been on the road for like 5 hours. And he announces the shutdown of all gatherings, over 50 people or whatever. We pulled over the side of the road. Hayley checks her phone. She already had an email that the gig was cancelled. We're playing the next night at a venue in Oakland called Spirit House, which has since closed down permanently through this. And of course, Spirit House were like, we have to cancel that. And then we're sitting by the side of the road, and over the period of about an hour, both of our calendars, just everything got cancelled. I chilled for a couple of days just to kind of check out of the world. And then checking back in, for me, my first thought was, I don't think touring is ever coming back. When I say that, I was thinking me flying 3,000 miles to perform 1 hour of relatively obscure music. I was just like, that shit is over. And of course, touring is coming back. It'll look different, but I wanted to act like, okay, if this is over, what am I going to do? And then if it does come back, that's a bonus. But I knew I couldn't sit around and be like, okay, I got to wait this out and just wait for the gigs to come back. That just wasn't even an option. And I think it's, the people like peers who I'm seeing thrive through this, many of them are the ones who are able to look at it like that. It's like, okay, this is an opportunity moment. We have, individually and then collectively, we need to do stuff.
Yeah, we don't want to work at the VHS factory while DVDs are getting pumped out.
Well, exactly. I mean, over the last few days, you see Cirque du Soleil went bankrupt. Nike posted almost $1 billion of losses, and they're going to lay people off. And if Live Nation's doing their thing, it's like, if these massive companies are in that kind of state of attrition, then it's very clear. At the same time, venues announcing, we're permanently closed, or art galleries, photographic galleries, we're now online only permanently. These are daily conversations now.
Yeah, and what did I do? I went on Bandcamp because I knew Bandcamp was going to give 100% of the proceeds to the artist, and I supported you. And this year, and Another Story, 2 tracks you did with Anthony Nicholson, it reminded me of Harry Whittaker's Black Renaissance, where if you're talented enough, 2 tracks is all you need for a balanced, complete project.
Man, that's big. That's big praise. Thank you. Harry Whittaker's Black Renaissance that's one of my Desert Island discs. It's actually been an inspiration for me ever since I heard it. Like, as far as how the shape works and the suite-like approach to the whole thing, like it hangs together as one piece. yeah, I mean, I didn't think of that working in the collaboration with Anthony, but yeah, we had a lot of fun, and he's one of my favorite house music producers, and I just hit him up one day, and so the inevitable is like, well, let's work, and we made those 2 tracks, which came out super nice. But yeah, man, that Black Renaissance, that's a special one.
It's going to be an exciting time, but at the same time, America, get your shit together, wear a mask, stay home, so my friend here can travel around our planet sharing music and good vibrations if he wants to. But if he doesn't, he's going to thrive either way. But I do want to give you this time to plug your Patreon, your any websites, any Bandcamp, so people can support you the way I'm supporting you.
Man, thank you. Like, firstly, I appreciate the support, so thank you for that. And the things you've asked me are really informed, and you've thought about that, so I appreciate that, man. Totally. So yeah, the Patreon is where I'm focusing the majority of my creative effort right now. I've set that up there's like 4 tiers. There's like a monthly new music exclusive. I'm making a new track each month, especially for Patreon only. There's monthly live streams. We're doing community Zoom chats. We had a great one actually the other week. I asked everyone to bring a piece of music or an album they're inspired by, so we all shared that over Zoom and talked about that stuff. I'm doing like masterclass video lessons, exclusive vinyl. There's a whole lot of stuff there. But I'm most excited there about, it's building a community, which is, it's unified through everyone's support of what I'm doing, but we're able to do that to kind of reflect that back to each other and keep the inspiration going. So for me, that's the main thing. So it's patreon.com/MDCL. Bandcamp is definitely the number one place to support people releasing music. Most of the money goes back to the artists. So if people can check that out, that's always great. Just type in my name, Mark the Clive-Lowe on Bandcamp. But yeah, I'm always happy to hear from people and just connect. I think that's one of the great things about tech now. The fourth wall's gone, and I could make a lot of effort to be a mysterious, enigmatic creative, but I just don't think that's what I'm here to do. So I'm really happy to open access and share ideas and build.
I'm exhausted, man. Covering your life in just 40 minutes is a whirlwind. But I hope I did a good job, and I really, really appreciate you being here, man.
Man, thank you. Thank you for your support. And yeah, man, thank you for doing Bedroom Beethovens. It's great.
My honor, man. Thank you.
Yeah.